Everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to do my top 10 reads of 2020. I am freshly back from visiting my hometown where I spent the past week celebrating the holiday, and we even got a white Christmas, which was a great way to end what is probably for a lot of us a very awful year. I also got some books for Christmas, which I think like TBD, I'll do a 2021 reading plans video. For this list for today, I actually thought it would be like way easier to make because I only read around 55 books or so. Compared to last year, I read around 140 books. So I would say this year was still just as hard in terms of doing the honorable mentions and also the top 10. And I think with this top 10 this year, I think definitely with the pandemic, it certainly affected my reading, but I'm really happy to say that at least half of this top 10 list I think I was really on the pulse of the new releases that I wanted to read this year because that was my 2020 reading goal. But surprisingly for this year, for my top 10, I don't have any classics on it. And last year I had at least 5 of them being classics. But this year also, I also have nonfiction on my list. And last year I just watched my old video and I had no nonfiction in my top 10, which is really surprising. So starting off like last year, I wanted to give the top or the honorable mentions, and these were all books I decided I really liked in the moment, but they didn't really stay with me. And so those books are Jack by Marilynne Robinson, Swann's Way by Marcel Proust, The Idiot by Dostoevsky, Arturo's Island by Elsa Morante, and Idaho by Emily Ruskovich. So starting off with number 10, we have Selected Stories by Alice Munro. I know this is completely my fault, but every time I go grocery shopping or find out like this week that my mail got stolen, I just keep imagining myself as an Alice Munro character. As a master of the mundane, I think stuff like this or just reading Munro stories really heightened for me, especially this past week whenever I went to visit my hometown, where it really made me appreciate the ordinary. I've said this about Monroe before, but I just really appreciate her comfortingly familiarity and just her insistent prodding into a character's psyche, where their passiveness is kind of just a way of reminding myself that the interactions with people also benefit by having rewards to them, but also similar consequences. I know it sounds vague whenever I say it like that, but Monroe really just reminds me that my life isn't as obvious as I think it is, and at any moment I feel like it could be specific in its own way of being revelatory or celebrated, I should rather say. That just really makes me appreciate fiction in general. Up next I have Phuc, which is an essay collection by Tressie, McMillan, Cottom. This is one of the most recent reads I have on my list, and I think really just as a work it's so strong, but also just based on how diverse it is with its topics of racism and blackness. Cottom's sense of voice especially is so strong while being informative and sometimes cheeky without being condescending, and the topics themselves are clever and refreshing without feeling like recycled conversations on the topic of systemic racism. And I think the success of this collection is definitely how Cottom doesn't necessarily give us a call to action or anything, but she never leaves us without the tools to know that we can do better. She so effortlessly gives these citations embedded in how she uses narrative to project the essays that she's writing about without really ever making it about herself. So yeah, I definitely recommend this one. It's definitely one that I'll be recommending to a lot of people in the future. Up next I have a memoir, and that is How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. While this memoir is slim, it really does pack a wallop at how Jones describes coming out as a black gay man. I would say the focal point of this narrative is his relationship with his mother while also going through the hoops of college and adulthood. What I really liked about how Jones was writing about his life is that when it comes to him discovering his sexuality, he never was, in a sense, I would say, distracted by it. Rather, it felt really instinctive for him to automatically think about how he could include his newfound sexuality into his existing life already without having to sacrifice anything. And Jones's ability to retain that instinctive quality of sentimentality at being both naive but also cherishing how his sexuality is different, or at least acknowledging how it affects his race as well. I think all of that working together was so on point and really perfect. The prose is also straightforward while also being a bit romantic, but with any sort of victories, I would call them, that Jones has, they really do feel special in that way of really sort of tying the knot on what Jones's life up to this point really meant to him in terms of these topics of discussion in his memoir. I really recommend this one, not only just for fans of memoir, but also anyone interested in reading more, especially what's interesting to me, both about being sort of exploring your sexuality but also your race at the same time. This next one is maybe no surprise to anyone on my list, but it is The Lying Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante, translated by Anne Goldstein. There's no one quite as matched as Elena Ferrante whenever it comes to diving into the psyche of her female protagonists. Even more interestingly, I think I love how Ferrante explores her characters through how other characters objectify the protagonist, while the protagonist both chooses what she likes about that, but also how she more often than not repels against the notion of the social construct of beauty. But what's amazing is that none of this is exactly new to me as a Ferrante reader, but it's always a pleasant surprise about these different mirrors of observation to how beauty is explored by being labeled or at least perceived as romantic from a narrative stance, but it's like Ferrante always knows she's setting me up to fail, to think that things will work out, even though in the back of my mind I'll probably get hurt in the end if I were to imagine myself being the protagonist in her stories. In particular, The Lying Life of Adults is about a girl named Giovanna who is coming of age, and she's really figuring out what beauty means to her and how other people are perceptive on how she prefers to look through their gaze versus how she looks at herself. But it's not even for selfish reasons, it's for a bunch of other reasons beyond romantically, also being about her family as well. So yeah, this is a great reminder for me to also say that while I don't think this book is necessarily really up there with the Neapolitan novels, that for your 2021 reading plans, you can finally read the Neapolitan novels. At number 6, I have Real Life by Brandon Taylor. This is about a black man named Wallace who is a rural college student discovering more about his sexuality and also being in a white-dominated area. I will say for me, I think I cared more about Wallace's interactions with being in a very white space, more so than I cared about his ideas about his sexuality also affecting the white space that he inhabited. But I did mention this in my separate review of this book, that I think Wallace is probably one of the most interesting characters I've ever read, especially for this year too. There's something introspective but also self-destructive about how he describes himself, especially in comparison to his friends. There's one part that really stuck out to me where Wallace is describing how it's a realization to him that his friend admits that his sense of life isn't as foundational as Wallace thought it was, and for Wallace's point of view, that means that's not his truest sense of life being correct if he's already wrong about what he thought about his friend. So in Wallace's destructive sense, he begins to undermine his own life until he actually helps someone that he knows already as an acquaintance kind of discover their own newfound sexuality. In this case, for his acquaintance, this would also become one of those new perceptions of real life that Wallace would have to help with, and then Wallace will likely eventually become a story for this person. So with me saying all that stuff, I will put a disclaimer that not all of that is exactly like fully contextual or has clarity in the narrative or the plot of this book itself. That's just me making my own interpretations, but I do think for me that's what the success of this book was. If you've been following me along for my reviews this year of books I've been reading, there have been many disappointing gay books, so I would say stacked against the rest that for Wallace, I really liked his story in terms of really relating to a lot of sort of what I am trying to wonder what contemporary gay stories are doing that feels a bit different. So we are now at number 5, and number 5 is Summer by Ellie Smith. A part of this appearing on my list, I will say, is for sentimental reasons, as I did now finish the seasonal quartet by Smith. Summer actually closes nicely because it does culminate kind of all previous entries in some way by making some callbacks about some previous characters. And this will sound cheesy, but I think with this happening, with these other characters appearing, but really Summer not being about them, I think it's a nice, pleasant reminder of Smith showing the power of what you can do with this space to allow characters to really reveal themselves. But Summer is actually my favorite entry in the seasonal quartet because it felt relaxing, but also doesn't necessarily mean it was being careless. It was also pretty jarring to read a story, or at least a storyline, about mentioning COVID in this time now, kind of reminding me in a sense with, even with the past entries to the seasonal quartet, how, for example, with Autumn talking about Brexit, how eventually all of this will kind of be its own memory and have its own place in the context of linearity in time in that way. So it's a nice kind of coincidence that summer to me as a personal season is the most foggy but also like full of nostalgia and clarity at the same time for me. The prose in this book is very lucid and at times dreamy, kind of veering into that nostalgic feeling, but I will say I think the effectiveness, especially for me reading Summer, is being able to have read this quartet in real time beside the topics being discussed. I'm not really sure how this quartet will be remembered in years to come, but if you haven't read Smith, I would suggest maybe starting with the quartet, because I know there's been some Smith slander on BookTube, and I will not have it. At number 4, I have Saigon by Phuc Tran. This is a memoir where Tran describes moving to Pennsylvania from Vietnam with his family as he's assimilating into American culture and also getting to know himself better in the process. I loved this memoir so much because I just really loved how Tran was committed to honoring his past feelings of naivety growing up and thinking things were so much more important than what they were, whether that's discovering punk rock or whatever else. But Tran also doesn't cut any corners because he does also honor just as equally even the occasional hostility between himself and his parents. And it's really difficult, and I felt that sincerity of the difficulty Tran was feeling, having to also acknowledge that his parents, in a way, were also growing up, in a sense, having to have this same experience that Tran was having, even though he was much younger. Personally speaking, thinking of my mom immigrating here to the States, I definitely do relate to that sense of growing up to be much more observant than I felt like I should have been in understanding the vulnerabilities of my mom's frustration and anxiety trying to figure out what the American lifestyle was. But what I really loved about this memoir is Tran's sense of a punchline. Even though those punchlines aren't literal, it's just that I think Tran has like great timing with his writing, and it's so good and masterful at how he's able to frame his life in a structure that is linear but without feeling predictable. He really understands the moods of situations for all parties involved, so not just looking back selfishly at how he was simultaneously retaining a part of the memoir on how he felt as a kid, but also how he feels now as an adult, writing about the past. This memoir really has it all. It's heartwarming and charming while being funny and serious, but I couldn't recommend it enough. Number 3, I also have another memoir, and this is from way back in January, and that is Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener. This is about Wiener switching from a job in publishing to working in early 2010s Silicon Valley. And who would have known that in January 2020, little innocent me would have just, as I was reading this, I was just laughing at the idea of Wiener's vulnerabilities about the workplace and working virtually, and little did I know that's what my life feels like now. But I also read this memoir again back in September just to now live in this moment that we're in with technology, and I still really think it's so strong that Wiener describes this cultural touchstone of how none of us could have predicted how influential things like apps and tech industry stuff, how it is now with like our phones or whatever, and how it really is so present in our lives and how we operate. I do wish that Wiener would have touched more on her personal stances on advocating exactly how predictive app culture would become in affecting places like the workplace or the virtual workplace. But otherwise, clearly this made it at my number 3 for a reason, being that I think Wiener's voice is so sharp and she was so enjoyable to read, and I would definitely read her other sort of takes on how this sort of embedding of pop culture and also like real world functionality with technology kind of live together or coexist, because I think she talks about it in a really interesting way. Runner-up for my favorite read of 2020 is Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan. This story is about a girl named Ava who's living in Hong Kong teaching children English. But it wouldn't quite stop there for it to be a great read for me until the main character happens to be in their 20s and is also self-sabotaging themselves. Ava dips her toes into a relationship with a man named Julian and a woman named Edith. And Ava's never done anything like this before, and to me, Ava was always a character that was trying to maximize her best potential at the resources she has. So if she's never been in this somewhat polyamorous relationship before, I only saw that personally as a way for her to only learn more about what this means of how she feels about that personally so she can self-improve. So I don't think any of that is unhealthy, but what I do think is unhealthy is that Ava, you can tell she's not someone that exactly has the full plan of realizing what her intentions are, with how it could affect other people, even if people like Julian and Edith are very self-assured and I would say much more mature than Ava herself. With Julian and Edith being so mature in comparison, I think that really cuts away the fat of any potential of things being melodramatic or really creating the sense of enigma with Ava, because she does come off as being very ordinary because of this. So it doesn't really feel like that's the intention of the book being so endearing to me. What is endearing to me is how people actually talk to Ava in a very straightforward way. There are so many quotes in here, and I'll link to my review of this book separately where I talk about a bunch of those quotes, where Julian and Edith openly say about how they feel about Ava, and Ava also takes the time to freely give straightforward responses. Heralded as a millennial book, literally on the dust jacket of this, I think it's funny because it in a way is a contrast of there definitely is that familiarity of, to me, what it means to be a millennial is this constant sense of comparison. But where that comparison is literal between Ava, Julian, and Edith, I think what's refreshing is that the spin is that they are all three so transparent about what they want and what desire means whenever you cut away kind of the who says what or who did what kind of stuff. So the real enemy here in exciting times, I would say, is the constant sense of doubt in that comparison I mentioned earlier that really puts this as a trademark millennial book, even though I think millennial is a buzzword. However, there is one more millennial book, I will say, that is the best of them all, and that is Luster by Raven Leilani, which is my #1 read of 2020. Luster is about 20-something Edie trying to navigate her life through NYC and also her romantic endeavors. So if you had to put Exciting Times and Luster beside each other, I would definitely say they're both works that try to classify being a millennial, definitely with sense of there being professionalism, malaise, and perhaps some non-traditional relationship structures. But how Luster excels to me, after I really thought about it, is that I feel like Luster has less fatigue than Exciting Times, mainly because the momentum is kept by Edie, I feel like personally having more weight in self-processing herself, not only within her romantic endeavors possibly, but also her relationship with herself as a Black woman. In a way, actually, I think this serves as millennial bait, being that while Edie certainly does have her own sort of troubles with understanding what the framework of her relationships are, I think it all calls back pretty much a lot of times to me that her resolution for understanding herself the best will be understanding her past relationships with people that she's related to because of her race. I cite some examples in my separate review of Luster that I did a video on months ago whenever I read it, that I feel like it's on the basis of Edie feeling both empowered but also insecure whenever it comes to her race, and also being a woman on top of it all, that really shows her development in this story. To me, kind of the philosophy being that you can never quite learn yourself until you also have to learn how other people see you, on top of where you prioritize all of that stuff happening. And there's no greater time than being in your millennial 20-somethings than to have that self-doubt and comparison I mentioned earlier, like in Exciting Times, to really either choose to explore or basically self-sabotage yourself until you get an answer. And Luster, to me, really truly speaks, I think, to this inherent quality of what the pulse is of 20-somethings feeling now. And even if you're reading Luster and you're not, a millennial or in your 20s, I think it does tap into something that everyone can relate to in how they've ever felt a certain displacement of feeling in either a place, like literally, like maybe NYC for Edie, or your parameters with people around you. And that does it. Those are my top reads of 2020. Who knew we'd finally make it to the end of this year? I would love to know any reading highlights that you had for this year. Hopefully I'll get on the ball with my reading being much better next year compared to this year, and kind of my fatigue with everything going on. But as always, thanks for watching. I hope you had a good holiday if you celebrated, and here's to 2021. See you next time. Bye.